Hello, this is Dr. Ford, and here I'm going to be talking about the works of art on your list of works. And it begins in Egypt. The first work is called Menkaure and His Wife, and it is an Egyptian work of the Old Kingdom. Let's take a quick look at what Egypt looks like. It is a very long, skinny country on either side of the Nile River. It runs in the northeast corner of Africa. The Nile is a very, very long river, goes deep into Africa here and flows northward and empties into the Mediterranean Sea. It is surrounded by desert on the right side here, on the east side, and on the west, and on the sea up here, so that it's very isolated from the rest of the world. And of the rivers in the world where civilizations grew up, this is the most isolated. A civilization that lasted a very long time, and from about 3000 BC, close to just a few hundred BC, so for nearly 3,000 years, it thrived. One aspect of this isolation is that it was able to stay in a changeless state for a very long time, and that changelessness or timelessness is something that you can see in the works of art. This is a depiction of a pharaoh from the Old Kingdom early on, late maybe 2500 BC. And it has his wife and he's next to him, and it's made out of a kind of stone that's extremely hard, harder than granite. And it's very difficult to carve. You could see that the original block of stone, a big cubic block of stone, is still visible here. The cube sort of shape that it was in. You see here from the side that it goes up the back here, and the figures are still attached to it. And one thing that we respond to this and look at this and see, it's a very hard stone, it's very hard to work. Once it's made, it doesn't change. And the fact that it's still part of the block of stone makes it look like it's going to be this way forever, and so it has. That's one of the aspects of it that's the takeaway of Egyptian art, is permanence. And they wanted things to look permanent, and that's why they used such hard stone. And they carved it. It's not just the material, but look at how the figure is rendered. You see a man, he's standing, almost like a soldier at attention with his arms to his side, making fists. He has these little round things, right? Like his hands are around some little cylinders or little dowels of some sort. And he's standing, he has 1 foot forward, but he's in a permanent state. It's not like he's stepping forward like he's about to walk. He's standing with weight equally distributed on his feet, and that he will never move from this state. This is what he wants to look like, or what the people who made it wanted him to look like forever, and to have his wife by his side, and that it's part of the worldview of the Egyptians, is that they believed in an afterlife, and that when the pharaoh died, they would put him in a tomb, and that he would continue to live, or his soul would continue to live, and that he would be surrounded by all the things that surrounded him at the time that he died. And here he is depicted in a kind of a youthful state. He lived a long time, and he would have been old when he died. So depicting him as a youthful state, that this is the state he will be in forever. Let me give you a little background on the Egyptian religion, in that this is the way they saw the afterlife. At first, initially, they would build these things called a mastaba, which is a little box with a hole in the ground that goes straight down, and there would be a small chamber in here where they would bury a body, and they would bury it with food and offerings, and surround the body with the sort of things that the person had enjoyed in life, and they would block it up and have some little place here for the family to come over in future generations to hold services, I suppose, and pay their respects. So this is a very modest kind of thing that many Egyptians would have, And over time, it developed for the rulers into much bigger things. You can see that if you just put another box on top of it, another box on top of it, then you get this sort of pyramid shape, and it still has that shaft with the area, the burial chamber deep in the ground. And it eventually developed into what we know as the pyramids, and it has very complex series of chambers and shafts and things in order to for security reasons. I mean, they didn't want grave robbers to come and get all of the stuff that they put in there for the pharaoh, all the gold and jewels and things of value. And many of these tombs were broken into in the ancient times, and they saw what was happening, and they went to great efforts to try to avoid it. And if you've seen any documentaries and things on the pyramid, you'll see all sorts of things about how the ideas on how they were made. There's very complex things, and they were very took a long time and a lot of effort to make them. And the idea behind them was one of permanence. They wanted to make things that lasted forever, because eternity, because the soul lasted forever. So that's why we have these figures like this. They are standing rigidly, perfectly, at attention, with arms to the side. And a face, let's look at their face. It is stylized in a certain way. It looks natural to some degree. It has a roundness. It looks like the features are made to look like a specific person a little bit, but it also looks like an idealized face. So it's sort of splitting the difference between ideal, that is the perfect face, and what this person actually looked like. This little thing is a little false beard, and you notice that it's actually this little thin thing, and it's got this other thing here that looks like a block under his chin, but this is really just part of the original stone that has not been cut away. And the reason it's not been is so that this doesn't break off. Again, they want it to last forever. Similarly, the space between his leg, where his leg is sticking out here, that stone is still there holding his leg so that it can't move. Look at the features of his anatomy. You can see a little bit of ridge here where his collarbone is, and pectoral muscles, and his navel here, and the subtle change in surface to indicate where his ribs are, where his abdominal muscles are. So there's even some indication of the muscles in his arms, and even maybe in the vein in his arm is like they really want it to look like the person in a natural sense. That is, they want it to this is an example of naturalism, wanting to make something look like it really looks. But at the same time, it is a perfective version. So it is idealized, and at the same time being natural. You can think of it as if in the natural world a perfection existed, this is a rendering of it. There's something odd, though, if you look at the bottom part here, where there's the kneecap. It's kind of a square shape. This looks a little odd. And the shin also has a very kind of a sharp, pointy ridge on it. You can see it here, but it doesn't look quite as shin-like, or at least it doesn't look as naturally anatomically correct, and especially when you look at the thickness of the ankles here. These don't look really that correct, nor do the toes. It's like whoever was carving this wasn't taking the same pains to make accurate rendering of the figure as they did here, down here, where the legs are. Also, her arm. This is the wife's arm. It just looks kind of like a tube. Little indication of some flesh and the crease here, but it's really not that anatomical compared to his. So they have a different degrees of naturalism occurs in different parts of the figure. One reason for thick ankles, though, is to help keep it from breaking off. If you have ankles that are thin, in actual natural shape of the human ankle rendered in stone, it would probably break there, given the nature of the weight of stone, and that would be the weak point. So making it thicker would be a reason to do that, but that doesn't tell you why They made the toes like this, or the shin, or the kneecap. But still, it's interesting to look at all what they thought was important, what they thought needed to be said, and what the figure needed in terms of, this was going to be his body in the afterlife. I mean, the soul would inhabit this, and they wanted to be a perfect figure. And they wanted to be permanent. So all these things go together to make up, what we see as the final product. We have one other work from Egypt, and it's a kind of a counter example that is throughout the entire many, many centuries that Egypt existed. The look we just saw is one that was repeated endlessly for every pharaoh, and practically everything they did had that same sort of permanence. They used the hardest stones to last forever. They went to enormous efforts to make very large-scale images of pharaohs and the royal families, and columns and buildings and things. But there was this one odd period in the middle, or actually it's at the beginning of the New Kingdom, where one pharaoh decided to change things, and he changed them radically. But it didn't last. It lasted once he died, and a new pharaoh came up. Everything was changed back, for the remaining centuries. So I want to look at this period just because it's odd, and it exhibits a certain thing about the way things are depicted. This is the royal family. This is the pharaoh on the left, Imhotep, and his wife Nefertiti. And they have their children, two daughters, who they're holding. The father is holding the daughter in his arms, and he's giving her a kiss. The mother is actually three daughters. I forgot. There's one right here, sitting on her knee, pointing over at her father and looking up at her mother. Her mother is looking at the father. Then this other child is sort of climbing up her mother and trying to get her mother's attention, the way children do. All of this is much more natural. It's much more like capturing a moment in time rather than being timeless. It's made out of some sort of stone that's kind of like sandstone. It's not nearly as hard, and they didn't go into nearly as much trouble in terms of like carving away all the space around it the way they would in other things. This is called a relief carving, and you can see the shape of the body here, but it was carved out of this flat surface of the stone, and they didn't carve away this. So this was done much more quickly. It was done at a time where they wanted to change things, or like this one pharaoh wanted to change things, make them more a depiction of a moment in time, about the humanness of interactions here. But there's another thing going on. The shape of the figure is weird. Look at his stomach here. Look at the little spindly legs and tiny skinny arms. All of this is odd. These figures were rendered in this odd way for a reason. One was to break from tradition. There was a conscious effort to change from what had been to this new style, to accompany the changes that Imhotep had made to the country. One of which was to change all of the gods that they had to just to one god, just for the time of his rule, and then later they changed it back to the many gods. But for this period, he wanted a style, or was told to have this style, so as to illustrate this change. But when you look at these figures, what's going on is that they're idealized in a way that is different from the ideal that existed before. When you look at previous Egyptian art, it had a different kind of an idealization, and it brings us to, what does it mean for something to be idealized? Suppose you were a photographer and you were asked to take a picture of a perfect apple. So you went to the grocery store to get a perfect apple, and you looked and you picked up one, and it says, okay, this is pretty good, but it's not perfect. There's something wrong with it. And so you put it down, you pick up another one, and you look at it. Okay, this is better, but it has this other mistake in it. And you keep looking at them, and you find several different apples, and some of them are pretty good, but none of them have all of the qualities that you want in your idea of a perfect apple. So you have in your mind, after having seen all these apples, what a perfect apple would look like. You know, it would have the right shape and the right color, and it wouldn't have any bug bites on it, and you know, all the other attributes that an apple might have that you would have in your concept of an ideal. Well, another person might have a different ideal of what a perfect apple would look like. And if you wanted to make a drawing or a picture of a perfect apple, you would have to do it, you know, artificially. The perfect apple doesn't exist in the real world. But in this case, they seem to have gone very far. I mean, the neck is really skinny. The arms are really skinny. Apparently, at this time, they thought, well, spindly arms were more ideal than natural arms. Having the man, his belly sticking out like this, for whatever reason, they thought that was ideal. All the other things, the little chin coming out, the shape of the eye, all these distortions, you can see them more in a three-dimensional sculpture. This is the same person. All of these, his head is stretched on the vertical axis here, and his very long nose, his eyes, you see, have this shape that are very close to each other in terms of, they're very wide and very narrow. In this dimension, the lips don't look quite right. They look large in relationship to what you imagine that the king might actually have looked like. And again, we have this relatively skinny arms, it's skinny waist, and this little poofy stomach here. Hips almost like a woman's hips, so it kind of looks androgynous. But for whatever reason, they decided this was the perfect look. So when they made this royal family portrait, they gave it all these attributes, and apparently this was what they wanted. At this time, the Egyptians were thinking in terms of not permanence. They wanted something more natural, more lifelike. And so they have the figures of the children as small people, and they're behaving like children, and they're interacting with their parents the way parents interact with children, to a large degree, as a way to distance themselves from the traditional way of depicting, where everything would be in a permanent state. Now let's turn our attention to Greece. This is called the Riace warrior, the next work on your list of works. This is a standing male figure who's a warrior. Originally would have held a spear in this hand and a shield in this hand. And it would have had two eyes. If you see one of the eyes has fallen out. But other than that, it's very much like it was like the original. I mean, it hasn't changed much, because this work had been created in Greece during the classical period. And it was shipped to Italy, where the ship sank. And this work wasn't discovered until later in the 20th century. So it stayed underwater for all that time, and nothing happened to it, apparently. And there was a pair of them just like this in very good condition. It's unusual because bronze is a very valuable metal, and anything that would have still existed that was visible, that people had access to, would probably have been melted down. So it's good that we have this, and we can see just what an original Greek bronze looks like. It looks like a very realistic figure. The naturalism was to a much higher degree than we saw in Egypt. But this is not the very first one that they did. They had been working on this problem of representing a human figure for several generations, and prior to this, it started with a figure like this, and you can see that this is much more primitive looking. This is in a phase they called the archaic phase, just mean the old period, before the classical phase. And this is what the figures looked like when they first started. They're standing male figures, nude, and it was their idea of the ideal figure. And where they got this from, you might recognize it, from Egypt. The people in Greece traded with Egyptians, and they would send ships down there, and they would take the things that they would make, whether it was food or mostly handmade things like ceramic pots that were painted, or things made of precious materials that they were, would work into, putting a lot of work into a small space, so as to, be impressive things to trade. And by having some contact with Egypt, they saw what Egyptian art looked like. The artist who made this Greek figure may not have seen, or would not have seen, the specific figure that you see on the left, which is Menkaure. And as I said, when this was made, it was put into a pyramid and never seen again until modern times. So but it is the type of figure that was very common in Egypt. And so Greek people, when they went to Egypt, they would see figures like this one on the left. And when they decided they wanted to make standing male figures, they took some aspects of this figure to make their own. And you can see there's many different qualities that it has. The standing at attention with the arms straight to the sides, connected to the sides, made into fists, the odd-looking knees with a sharp shin, the left foot forward. All these things look like they just came directly from the Egyptian work. But they also made things different. First of all, it's a nude figure. And you may wonder, well, why is it nude? Why is this nude and the Egyptian one isn't? Well, the Egyptian one is the pharaoh, and he has a costume. This headdress and the kilt that he's wearing are identity part of, or the identity of the pharaoh, and that's how you recognize him as the pharaoh, because he's wearing this costume. Otherwise, he's nude, and he's a representation of an ideal male figure for the Egyptians. But for the Greeks, they had an entirely different religion, and their whole concept of the world was very different. When they had, when they practiced their religion, they had temples, and they would go to the temples and make sacrifices. And just as people in our day, when we go to church and we have when we dress up to go to church, we have what we call formal wear. Your Sunday best. You look your best for church, and they had that same idea, but in their culture, the idea of one's formal wear was nude. That is, that was your ideal state, is nude, and they were just about the only ones who did. And oddly enough, the works that they did have such staying power in Western civilization that we still recognize that it's okay, if to show nudity, if it is in the Greek ideal sense. That is, because they thought it was okay when the Romans overtook the Greeks and they acquired many of the aspects of the Greek culture. They thought it was okay to have nude sculptures, even though they themselves did not practice the same religion as the Greeks, and they didn't, go to temples in the nude and perform sacrifices in the nude the way the Greeks did. They thought that the idea of having sculptures that were ideal in this state was okay. And then when when the Roman Empire fell and the Christians took up Western civilization, they did the same thing later in the Renaissance when they decided to bring back many of those aspects of the ancient world. They had nude sculptures, and it was considered, because of its relationship to Greece, as an okay thing. And we'll see that when we get to the Renaissance. But it seems kind of odd otherwise, as just one of the aspects of their culture. But what we're looking at is the fact that there's a series of works where the Greeks would, began with this state as kind of a primitive state where they're just learning how to represent the figure, and it has these qualities that I mentioned. It's It's distorted a little bit. The eyes, these almond-shaped eyes that are a little too close. It's similar to what we saw in the Amarna period in Egypt. But the head seems a little out of proportion to the width of the shoulders. It's a little bit too tall. The pectoral muscles, you can see, are kind of like lines, and they're stylized. And the line between the rib cage and the abdominal muscles is just like a line rather than a subtle gradation of tone. Other parts of the body are oddly, not quite natural, but kind of close. The shape of the collarbones and everything. Many things are correct. Other things are, proportions are a little odd. But it's because this is the archaic phase. It's as if they don't yet know how to do it properly. And over the course of a couple of generations, like here's like the next level up, where you can see, they've gotten more anatomically correct in terms of the proportions of the head and the waist and the shapes of the thighs and everything, and it feels more like a real person, though it's still not quite there, because real people don't really stand like that, with a kind of at attention look to them. In the face, you can see the face, also has some odd qualities to it. But then when they get to the classical phase, they start getting much closer to naturalism. And they've added another aspect here that I want you to see, because it's going to be repeated endlessly, throughout history, is this particular pose. When you look at it in relationship to this pose, weight evenly distributed, what that does is cause the hips to be perfectly level, the shoulders level, and they're all in the same plane. There's a little bit of, this hip is a little higher than this hip, and it feels like there's a little bit of twist in the body, like that. This one's a little farther away, and this one's a little closer, and so they're not exactly in the same plane. It has to do with the fact that the weight of the body is on this leg, called the engaged leg, and this one has less weight on it. And by doing so, it changes the way the whole body stands. It's much more difficult to represent a figure this way than it was in the Egyptian way, like this, or the old Greek way, because here everything is pretty much symmetrical. Whatever you do to one side is exactly the same on the other. But when you start changing this subtle shift of weight, it changes everything. The figure, the front and the back, everything has to be taken into account. And this was an innovation in the direction of naturalism. And they decided our ideal state of a standing male figure is to stand kind of at ease and to have this pose, which is called the contrapposto pose. And they all, in addition to that, the fleshiness of it, the accuracy of the rendering of the figure in terms of the ribs and the muscles, the skin and the flesh, it's all feels much more real. Now, of course, this is a broken one, and you can't see all of the features, but look back at the Riace warrior, you can see that every part of the figure is as if they've observed and rendered exactly how it would be if the ideal figure existed in the real world. Every toe looks exactly like you expect a real toe to look like. And all the subtle things, the sinews, the joints, the ligaments and tendons, as if they understand the whole physical body. The veins, the proportions of the figure. And again, when I say proportions, I'm talking about it's proportioned like a real figure. This looks like an athlete. And you can imagine that they probably, just as the example I was just giving of the apples, if they were to look at lots and lots of different people, and you see different athletes, like runners have a different physique than a weightlifter, or all the different sports. You remember this Greece is where the Olympic Games came from, so they had lots and lots of athletes, and they were able to observe the different figures that, or the different possible proportions that different given figures have. And they decided that this proportion of head height and width and shape of all the parts is the ideal. Let's look at it from the back. You can see how that contrapposto pose affects everything. You know, the back, the left, and the right are different from one another. The engaged leg changes the shape of the hips, the shapes of all the muscles, the shoulders, the twist in the figure. It feels like it's much more alive. And speaking of naturalism, looking at the face, it is a combination of naturalism, wanting to make it as close as possible to the way reality looks, but at the same time, it's idealized. You know, the shape of the nose is this straight line that goes straight from the forehead. It's a particularly Greek thing to do that, and that was their ideal of a face for men and women. And for hundreds and hundreds of years, that was their ideal. The shape of the eyes, the shape of the mouth, everything is exactly the way it is in their perfect idea. The beard and everything, it has a great deal of naturalism compared to, you know, other sorts of things from the ancient world, except that it's much more swirly, and it has all these swirls are all in, you know, all gathered into locks, which each has its own sort of individual curl to it, very nicely done. But it isn't perfectly natural. You can see that it's almost as if they've idealized it in this particular degree. You know, they didn't. It's not symmetrical. It isn't exactly the way whiskers actually grow, but it makes a nice, pleasing pattern. Also, in terms of realism, something that you can do in bronze that you couldn't have done in stone is that, you know, it originally had eyelashes, and the eyes were holes that were filled in with some other materials. In this case, the jewels that would have been in the eyes are no longer there, but there would have been either glass or some sort of jewel that was polished and made to look like you know, an iris here. And you know, some white material, maybe bone or ivory or something for the white of the eyes, and eyelashes. And they have a different metal. And the bronze is the main metal, but they've used copper for the lips to make them a little more real. And you can't see it in this picture, but the teeth are actually visible, and they're silver. You know, so that they wanted this to look as much like a real person as they could, you know, within the limits of what you can do with bronze. But at the same time, they wanted to be the perfect version. And as it turns out, this perfect version is our perfect version. When people today look at pick figures to be the ideal exemplars of the human figures, it's this proportion. When Arnold Schwarzenegger was doing his bodybuilding to become the Mr. Universe, you know, he would look at Greek ideal figures and to see, you know, what muscles to make at what size and relationship so as to get a perfect figure. And that, you know, in our time is because of the staying power of the Greek ideal. That, you know, once Greek fell, it fell to the Romans, and the Romans took up that ideal. And later in the Renaissance, they had a rebirth of that ideal. And ever since then, you know, since the 1400s or the 1500s, it has remained the ideal. Okay, let's look at Greek architecture. This is the Parthenon. The Parthenon is a Greek temple, and as I said, they had a religion where they worship gods, and this one is to the god Athena, a particular aspect of Athena called Athena Parthenon, and so this is called the Parthenon. It is a building that looks like a box, and it has columns all around it, and the columns hold a lintel. It's called post and lintel architecture, where you have a vertical element and a horizontal element. And this will be contrasted with the Roman ideal that we'll see later, where they use arches instead of lintels and posts. But for this time, this was the system that they used, and they inherited from the Egyptians. In fact, the Egyptians had columns that had these same sort of vertical grooves in them called flutes, and they also had columns with capitals, and the whole system was something that they took, just like they took that figure, that ideal figure, and adapted it to their own use. This particular version of Greek architecture is called Doric. Doric means that it's the column capitals look like this. You know, they have little cushions, this little circular part, and then a square part here at the top. It doesn't have a lot of ornament on it, and other orders of Greek architecture have other different kinds of ornament that you would recognize if you saw them, because we in Western civilization have repeated endlessly all the different Greek orders and the Greek ideas of architecture, you know, for our architecture. And even the buildings on the campus at William Carey have similar features to them as these. But this temple is just as the male figures that you were just seeing is from a long line of temples that, you know, after they made each one, they decided, okay, the next one we're going to make it a little better, a little bigger, a little more refined. And so this is the ultimate in that line of succession, where they would take the box, that is this inner part here, and they would, with all of its columns all around it, and they would change proportions. They would change the spaces between columns, the length of the columns, the width of the columns, and all the different ornaments and things, and make them a little better each time until they get to this perfect state. Okay, now we're looking at it in a ruined state because it's very old and it's had a long history of lots of things happening to it, breaking it, and much of the work. It had sculptures up here, and those have been taken out and put in museums. But you can still kind of see a bit of its original magnificence. You know, this was just one of the wonders of the world at the time that it was made. It was beautifully built and beautifully designed thing. And it was designed to be seen from the outside. You know, it wasn't really so much about what was inside, though they did have a statue of the goddess Athena inside, and people could go in there and see it. But the main aspect of it was to see it from the outside and to see its grandeur, its wonderfulness, as it was just so well made. Here's what it looked like in the top of the hill where it's on is called the Acropolis, and it was just one of a number of buildings that were made up there. You would come from this area, from the ground level up to this, and when you came out through here, it was hidden from view. The Parthenon was hidden, so that when you came out, you finally got into an open space and you could see it. It would be a kind of a ta-da moment, and all of the sculpture up here was painted and lovely. And when the Greek civilization finally ended, and the Romans took over, they admired all these things that the Greeks had done, because it wasn't just architecture, it wasn't just sculpture, it was also they had historians, they had artists in all sorts of different mediums. They had writers, philosophers, and mathematicians, and scientists, and doctors, and they had all sorts of things that the Romans collected and saved. And when the Roman Empire eventually fell, it was the Christians who kept all of those things, so that we now know much about, the people who lived here and all the things that they thought. And all of that contributed to Western civilization. It was where, Western civilization was born. Not so much in Egypt, and the contrast that I was drawing between Egypt and Greece, shows that we are much more like the Greeks than we are the Egyptians. Now let's look. The classical phase lasted for just a generation or two, and then afterwards, it changed. Well, one reason is that it's the sort of change that always occurs in a kind of a cycle, where you go from a archaic phase, an early sort of primitive phase, and you get up to the point where you're at your best. You do things perfectly. And then afterwards, it's kind of hard to follow perfection. What do you do next? And you have to go in some other direction. And they did go into other directions. And as it happens in this period, it's called the Hellenistic Period, where Greek art or the Greek civilization was spread over a large area because of Alexander the Great and conquering lots of territory. And he took his Greek culture to lots of the parts east of Greece, where Turkey is now, and farther east than that. And all those places that had the Greek culture, they adapted it with their own cultures and changed it in different ways. And this is one of the ways. This is a work from your list called Laocoon. Laocoon is the name of a priest from a very old story called the Iliad, where that all the Greek cultures, lived by. That is their foundation story. And in it, there's a priest who is attacked by a bunch of snakes, and his two sons are also attacked. And this is a depiction of that event. It's a story. It's an illustration of a story, and it's an opportunity for an artist to show off skill in representing the human figure, in doing something other than just standing in a contrapposto pose. Here's a man who's seated and he's struggling with snakes. And so his body has a twist to it. His one leg is up here with his knee right there and his foot, on the ball of the foot right there. And the other is reaching down at a farther level with the ankle, more straightened out, and then the toes flexed in this way. And his hips are here, and he has this twist in his body. And you notice that the figure, he's more like a Hercules kind of figure. It looks really, really musculature, muscle bound, I guess you could say. And the twist is causing one arm to go one way and the other arm to go this way. His head is tilted back and to the side. And he's got this great, expression on his face of anguish. All of these things are far from what we saw in the classical period. In the classical period, there were so many figures just like this, just standing over the course of the short time that the classical period lasted. They refined and refined this figure to be more and more perfect, until they got it to absolute perfection. But where you go from there is to add movement, add emotion. Well, here we go. This has the movement, and it has emotion, and it has a storytelling. This is not a timeless image of just a man standing, but it is capturing a moment in time. In fact, the most dramatic moment, the greatest extent of the pain and the anguish and the motion and the struggle. So this was the direction that one of the directions that Greek art went after that classical period. Another direction is this one. It's not on your list, but it's another different way that the Greek Hellenistic period, changed from those standing figures. This is called the dying Gaul, where it's a man, a soldier who's actually the enemy soldier in a war that's commemorating a battle and showing how the enemy soldier is dying. So he's sitting on the ground, and he has a wound in his side, and his life is ebbing away. And the artist is taking great pains to show the figure is exactly as a figure looks, in a perfect realism, even to the point where their enemy had mustaches, so he gave him a mustache and a particular kind of hair style, so you could recognize the particular thing rather than some ideal that is general. Another direction that it went was something like this, called the Nike of Samothrace. Nike, like the shoes, Nike means victory. It's the goddess of victory. And here, even though the arms are broken off and the head's broken off, you can see that an artist has given the illusion of movement and also weightlessness. It's like a flying angel kind of figure who's alighting on the prow of a ship. And it looks light, even though it's made of stone and weighs many, many hundreds of pounds. It looks as though it's floating because of the formal qualities that the artist has given it, with his shapes of the drapery going around the legs. You can see the forms underneath the drapery and all the kinds of things that the twists and turns and the tensions within the figure are all represented, very, very skillfully, because once you got to the point of here, skill was, depicting nature as it actually looks was already achieved, from comparing that to where they started. It took some number of generations to get from here to here to here and to here. But once you get to here, then, it is required that an artist a sculptor is capable of representing reality. And then which reality you do, which story you tell, is now open to lots of different possibilities. And this is the example that I'm giving you as that extended possibility. Now we turn to the next work on your list, which is the Pantheon, which was built during the Roman Empire. Now, the Romans began their civilization in Italy, where the city of Rome is now, almost concurrently to the Greek civilization. I mean, in the 700 BC or so. And over the course of several centuries, they grew up and acquired much of the territory of Italy, and created their own civilization. And it to a large extent, it had many of the characteristics of other indigenous peoples of Italy, and they were, somewhat different from Greece. But they were sort of like a younger brother growing up in the shadow of an older brother who's much more sophisticated, more educated, and they admired the Greeks very much. And when it came time for them to conquer Greece, they did it in such a way so as to not destroy it, but to absorb as much of the Greek culture as they could. One of the things was in temple making. They both, had the same sort of religion, though not the same religion, and they both made temples. But the Romans had a different kind of temple that they made. But they admired the Greek temples so much that they essentially put the Greek temple on the front, or on as like clothing, as a costume almost, on their Roman temples. And this particular Roman temple is kind of odd. It's not the normal kind, which would have been a box-shaped thing. But this one, it does have a sort of a box-shaped front with a pediment and a tablature and columns, just like the Parthenon has. In fact, many aspects of this came directly from Greek building. So, the order is Corinthian rather than Doric, but otherwise it's very much like a Greek temple. But it's just a front for another building that's sort of in the back, and the one in the back looks like this inside. It's a cylinder with a hemispherical dome on top of it. And it is a remarkable sort of building as a engineering thing to make something that has an enormous dome in a very large span that the thing is covering, and that it still exists, it's still standing. And it's a wonderful place. If you ever go to Rome, it's a thing to see. It's a very big space covered by this gigantic dome, which is necessary if you're going to span such a long space. It's like 140 something feet across, and you couldn't do that with there's no tree with you'd have a beam to go across it to hold up a roof. You have to have a dome. And a dome is something that the Greeks didn't use. It involves an arch, and arches are such that the way it works is that the weight of the materials sort of move along the edge, here along the arch, and is transferred to the ground that way, rather than causing a horizontal thing, which the Greeks would have, would sag in the middle if it had to span such a long distance. But when something sags, what's going on is that the weight of the thing is causing the material to be both stretched and compressed at the same time. Stretch means it's under tension. When something is under tension, it stretches, and materials like stone don't have very much strength to resist tension. It will snap. If you have a lintel, a very long lintel made of stone, it would just break. But if you put stone in this shape, then what's going on is that it's taking advantage of the fact that the material is under compression. That is, it's being pushed onto itself, and it has tremendous strength to resist compressive strength. So if you just have enough mass down here, you'll be able to have an arch as big as you want it, or at least till you get to the limits of what compressive strength stone has. But notice first that you have this big space. This part here is a cylinder, that shape. It's a cylinder. It's half as high as it is wide. And then the space up here is half of a sphere. If you were to continue the sphere, it would go all the way around to the floor. And that geometric shape is an interesting aspect of it, that it's conceived of as simple geometric shapes. But once they have this shape, and they've engineered a way to make this concrete and stone and rubble and stuff that they use to make it, they're able to decorate it. And once you decorate it, how do you decorate? You put something on its surface. And the surface of the inside looks like this. It's got marble that's very fancy, expensive marbles that have been sliced and polished. They have really, beautiful grains and colors and things. It has these orange kind of columns right here. And it gives the impression that these columns here are holding up that dome. But the thing is, it's kind of fake in the sense that these columns are made of a material. It's even though it's marble, it's not a very strong marble, so it doesn't have a lot of compressive strength. In fact, it hardly has enough strength to hold itself up, much less this lintel and anything above it. But what's going on is behind the scenes, behind this marble facade that you see on this inside, there's lots and lots of structure, and that structure involves arches, like this kind of arches, which deflect all of the mass that's coming down from this giant dome up there, and diverts it behind here to these giant piers down here, and sort of out of sight. So you don't see what's holding the building up. You just see beautiful columns and beautiful marble and lots of decoration, which in the direct decoration all comes from Greece. So the Romans, they admired Greece for its look, but not for its structure. The structure of a Greek temple, as you remember, it's post and lintel. It's got columns and it's got an entablature. But that's not the structure of a Roman building. Roman buildings are based on arches. Arches are what hold the building up. But they articulate it with decorations, and those decorations come from Greece. And the Greek decoration is not being used the way the Greeks would have used it. But that's just the Romans all over. That's the way they treated everything. They acquired things from the peoples that they conquered and mixed it with their own thing to create a new expression, and that's what's going on with the Pantheon. Pantheon, by the way, means a temple that's dedicated to all the gods. Pan means all, and notice it also has a hole called an oculus in the very top of it. And if you know anything about arches have they normally have a keystone. If you think of a dome as just a three-dimensional arch, this doesn't have a keystone. I mean, and that's, you think that if you have an arch and you take the keystone out, the whole thing will fall down. So how is it that they're able to have all these arches and take out all of the keystones of all these arches to keep it and still have it stand up? But the reason is that this ring around it has all of the compression of all of these things pushing against it equally. So they're sort of tying it all off, I guess you could say, so that is to make it remain standing. And it's a remarkable bit of engineering, because it's whatever it is they did when they made it, they did it right, because it's been standing there for almost 2,000 years now, and any number of earthquakes have occurred in that intervening centuries, and it's still standing. So that's the Pantheon. The next, the Roman Empire is a long time. Many centuries go by, and there's lots of different things. But we're just sort of taking a few samples throughout history. And the next sample we're going to do is towards the end of the empire, when the Roman Empire turned Christian. And in the century between 300 and 400, the Roman Empire first had an edict that allowed Christianity to exist along with all the others, and then later in the century it became the official religion of the empire. And when that happened, they started to need churches for the Christians. You remember in the early Christian days, in those intervening centuries, they were persecuted, especially in Rome, in the Colosseum. You probably heard stories, feeding them to the lions and things. Well, in the 300s, it became the official religion, and when doing so, they needed big churches. And the next work on your list is called Old St. Peter's. And this is a section of what it looked like. The reason we don't have a photo of it is because it was torn down after it had been serving as the main church of Christendom for practically 1,000 years. But they built a new church called St. Peter's, or the new St. Peter's, to replace it. And that was done in the late 1500s and 1600s. So, but what we're looking at is this church, and the reason that we've chosen this to be a sample is because this is the model of all the churches, practically, that are made for the next 1,000 years or more, and it's called the Basilican structure. And to understand that, you need to know what a basilica is. This is a Roman basilica. It's a building that they had during the Roman Empire. It's not a temple. It's more like a government building, or sometimes it's almost like a shopping mall, or it would be a legal building, maybe a court, or some other sort of institution building that they needed in the Roman Empire to administer their empire. That wasn't a temple. When they built temples, they had other sorts of structures that were based on the way temples have to work and have to function. But when they needed a great big box to hold a lot of people, they would make what's called a basilica. Basilicas look like this. They have a big open space surrounded by columns, And it has two levels, a column level down here and a level up here where light can come in. It also has an apse on either end, which is a semicircular area back here, which has some different functions depending on the building. Sometimes they would have a statue of the emperor here or some other sort of thing. It sort of focuses your attention to have an apse at one end. But when Christianity came to the Roman Empire, they needed churches, and a Roman temple, if they wanted to copy a Roman temple to use as a church, it wouldn't work very well because temples aren't really suited to a Christian service. What a Christian service needed was a great big barn-like shape that could house lots of people, and they naturally chose the Basilica as the structure for their churches. And this is a cross-section of what one would look like. The interior part, the big main space, is just like a basilica has, is called the nave. And it's got a row of columns on either side. It's got a space over here that is... the reason that it has this space is because to cover up the part over the roof over the aisles. It has aisles on either side of the nave, and it has a roof that doesn't go up as high as the roof of the nave does. And between these two spaces is a row of windows called the clerestory. And at the back here is an semicircular apse, and that apse would be where, instead of having a statue of the emperor, where a basilica would have, it has the altar. And so all these lines sort of focus your attention down to the altar, and it makes a longitudinal axis down which you can go to have processions and things towards the altar, which is something necessary in the Christian liturgy. And it has all this extra space for people when lots and lots of people come. And there's another aspect you can't see in this image, but there's a crossing right here called the transept, which is something they added that basilicas didn't have. But otherwise, this is the basilican structure, and this became the model for all the future Christian churches for many centuries afterwards. All right. After the Roman Empire fell, between 400 and 500, the world was sort of thrown into a kind of a chaos. There wasn't any big authority in Europe that was ruling anywhere, and the local indigenous people who had been conquered by the Romans started to build up their world again, after the Romans left and after their rule was over. Well, those people, the Romans called barbarians, and just because they didn't speak Latin and they spoke a corruption of their language that the Romans just recognized as it sounded like dogs barking, so they call it barbar, so barbarians. Anyway, they made art even before the Romans came, and they continued to make art, and it's different from what the Romans made because these are people, many of whom were nomadic. They didn't stay in the same place all the time, and so any art that they made had to be small, and portable. And so jewelry is a kind of a thing that they made. And this is a purse lid that would be the sort of thing that decorates the top of a purse. There would be some sort of leather bag, something under this, and this is the cover up the top of it, and the hinges would be attached to it so that you can open and close it. And it would be, a decorative, ceremonial sort of thing. And what we're going to look at is how this is decorated. And here's another work similar to it. Also is made of gold and has lots of fine craftsmanship, putting lots of work into a small space. And the reason that I've chosen this work is because the art that's going to be made in Europe for the next several hundred years is going to be very much influenced by the kind of work that was made by the indigenous barbarian people of Northern Europe from before the Romans ever got to them. They had their own traditions. So let's see what it looks like. This is called a cloisonné technique. It's where you have metal, and it's got very thin pieces of metal here, and to make little box-like shapes segments that are filled with either glass or like a precious stone or something with bright colors. Cloisonné, I mean, is closed. The color is sort of closed all around with a precious material. In this case, it's gold. And it takes lots and lots of work to make something like this, and it's a very fine, detailed sort of thing. But look, in addition to that, the decorative aspect and the preciousness and the like a treasure aspect that you have of it, look how figures are made. Here's a picture of a man. You can see he has a kind of a mustache. He has a circular head with two eyes there. And he's got arms coming down like this, and there's his two legs. And he has these two things on either side, which you can read as kind of like animals, maybe wolves or something. And they have an eye and a mouth that's sort of directed towards him. Notice they're symmetrical. They have this sort of arm, I guess it's holding his arms maybe, and this is his feet, and other feet down here sort of holding his, so that he's being attacked by an animal or two animals here. And then you have another pair of things that are also symmetrical. It looks kind of like birds. I mean, this looks kind of like a beak. This kind of looks like a beak, maybe even a duck's beak. Something that looks like feathers here. Up here, this is harder to read because it's kind of like a knot, because it's got all these little lines that go over and under one another to create this sort of interlocked pattern. It's called interlace. And if you try to figure it out, well, if you think of this as a head and this is a body, and it's got a leg here, and that leg continues out over here and makes a little foot, and then this is a leg, and then it continues out and has a little foot over here, and there are other little figures like some sort of animal that is just, it's been distorted from the way animals look into something that just has shapes and lines and little interlaced pieces that make a pleasing knot pattern. And then you have this thing over here with lots of pattern that's repeated here. You've got these little arch lines that go one way, then another way, and it just opportunities for putting a lot of work in a small space and having color and having precious materials. So all of these things, all these qualities, this has. And we look at another example that's similar to it. It was found at the same place. This was found in a place called Sutton Hoo in England. Hoo means hill, and they had these burial mounds around in remote places in England, just like we have like Indian burial mounds. And archaeologists would dig them up, and they found something like this in it, and said, oh, this comes from even before the Romans or some very earlier times. And back when the people had to make, if they were going to have art at all, it had to be something small and portable. And this would be some sort of clasp that you would have to clasp a garment to. It has a little hinge on one side, and like you have some sort of cloth that goes over your shoulder, and it would clasp it together. Anyway, it has the similar sort of bright colors of glass or some sort of precious material inlaid into a bunch of gold. And it has these little figures that like kind of like snakes or animals with long spindly legs that intertwine with one another. And then you have this weird contraption up here, which is difficult to read, but when you do read it, you can see that there's a head here. This is an eye, and that's an ear, and that's a mouth, and there's a tooth there. It's a boar's head. And that's his neck. His neck goes over here to a tail right here, and there's a back leg. The front leg is right here, and notice that there's two overlapping animals, so that they're symmetrical, just like these two things are symmetrical or these two things are symmetrical. Only they're overlapping one another to create this pattern. So, pattern, precious materials, interlace, distorted animals, and figures. All of these are qualities that make up this style. And the reason that we're looking at it, and we want to sort of identify it and characterize this style, is because when Christianity eventually comes to these people, they make works of art that use this style in a different medium. This is the work that we're going to have on our list, which is is from the Book of Kells. It's called the incipit page from Matthew. The Book of Kells is a gospel book. It's just the entire Bible is too big to make into one whole book most of the time. It would be enormous. But if you're going to make a book of the Bible, then you at least have the four Gospels. So it was very common to have the Gospels as one big book. And this is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and this would be the first page of the text of Matthew. But let's look at how this sort of thing came about before we get into this. 100 or 200 years or so before that was made, they were making things like this. And this is much closer to that jewelry we were just looking at. This is Mark, by the way. This is a lion that represents. And you can see how this figure of an animal has been distorted and turned into a pattern of shapes. You can see the little checkerboard thing there, or harlequin sort of pattern in making up his body. It looks like this is pulled straight out of that kind of jewelry we were looking at. And the decoration of the panels on the side, around the edge, also have that same sort of look. So that the look of the jewelry went straight into the first manuscript illumination. Now, manuscripts are, they're on leather or parchment, and that has been specially prepared to be like pages in a book. You remember that, before printing, all books had to be handmade, and before they had, an easy access to paper, they used parchment instead. So it was an enormous investment to make any book at all, and something like this would be something that would put huge amounts of effort and time and labor and expense into making something like this. And this is the really, really early days, and maybe 600 A.D. Or between 600 and 700 that they were making this, called the Book of Doro. And later, when they got more sophisticated, the same sort of cycle we've seen before, where they starts out primitive and you get more and more sophisticated. This is from the Lindisfarne Gospel. You can see that the artists who make this are using the same sort of ideas of animals being distorted into these shapes that have interlace so as to make decorative patterns. That's their medium of expression. And when we get to the book that we're looking at, this would be an even more extreme case where they take that idea of those patterns and make them even smaller and more intricate and fill every space with them. And this, by the way, these are letters. This is the word, Liber, L. This is the letter L. And then I, B. It's kind of hard to see that as a B, but it's a B. And then E and R. So Liber means book. This is the book of the generations of Christ, which is the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew. And so putting all of this effort into a small space is, even though it's painted on, it is like the same sort of effort that the jewelry makers were doing to make a precious, treasure-like object. The monks who would have been making these illuminated manuscripts were doing them in a place called the scriptorium, which is a room inside of a monastery. And there were monasteries scattered all over Europe. There were like Christian churches surrounded by a group of monks in a group of buildings that were walled off and in a secluded spot. And their purpose was to live a religious life, away from the rest of the world. And the work that they did was to be self-sufficient and grow their own food and raise their own farm animals and make themselves, not dependent on the rest of the world. And at the same time, their work was to follow the rule of Saint Benedict, who started the monastery system. And one of the main things that they would do, or one of the most valuable things they would do, is keep books and make books. That is, they would have libraries, and they would, in a scriptorium, they would produce more and more books, usually copies of books that already existed. And they had collections of all the great books that had been written up to that point, books that were Greek, books that were from the Roman era, books that were Arabic, books that were part of the scholarship having to do with the Bible, all the books of the Bible. They would collect all these things and copy them. And if one monastery had a book that another one didn't have, they would borrow it and make a copy of it. And so that by doing this, they could keep their traditions alive and all the history alive for essentially maintaining Western civilization during the days after the fall of the Roman Empire and before the beginning of the Renaissance. They were able to keep all of these things and so they didn't get lost. Sometimes monasteries got destroyed. I mean, they would be attacked by Vikings or any number of outside invaders. But it has been said that if out of 100 monasteries, if 99 of them got destroyed, they could reproduce everything from that one that was left, because they were so diligent with their copying and preserving things. But for our purposes, making things like this, like a gospel book and with all of this decoration and putting huge amounts of work, it was part of the devotional service that the artist would do, is part of their work, part of their worship. And so they would sit there in these dark scriptoriums with candlelight, and they would have pens made of bird feathers, and ink made from who knows what, some vegetable dyes and all sorts of things. Sometimes colors were imported from all over the world. Some precious colors that they couldn't get locally, they could get from all sorts of different places. And they would make these precious objects. And the style that they used, look at those little knots and things in there. It just goes on forever. I mean, this isn't an enormously high resolution image, but if you had one, it would just go on and on and on, it seems, to these, some of these little circles. They used a compass to draw circles that, as small as a radius of 2 millimeters. And all the tiny little things, or you can imagine an artist thinking it is his duty to God to put as much labor and love into one of these books. Okay, now let's turn our attention to cathedrals. The architecture of the Middle Ages is going to be mostly what we're going to look at is churches, and churches are, have a long history that go back to the old St. Peter's in this form, this basilican form, with a nave and aisles and transept and apse. Well, those forms continued, and we have them here, just like old St. Peter's, except there's much more more stuff has been added. And what we see here would be called the front door of the church, is the west works. Usually churches are oriented so that the front door is on the west, and the apse at the other end is on the east side. And then there's this transept, and notice it makes a cross. And this is a very, very clear looking cross shape. Sometimes it's not as clear, but this covers the nave. So underneath this part here, this triangular roof shape, is the nave shape, and it's represented, you could see in this rectangle right here. That's where the nave would be. And the aisles, one on either side, are represented here, where these towers are, and they go underneath here, all these other building buttresses here. And it has the same sort of articulation on the inside as this is the inside of the church. It's a church called Chartres Cathedral in France. It's near Paris. Just as the Old St. Peter's had. It has a colonnade going down the nave like this. But in this case, the columns are really big, and they have extra columns that make it more complex, make it into a kind of a pier. And those extra columns, they describe stuff that's going on elsewhere in the building. So let's look at the forms. You've got the colonnade going here, and notice it's not columns with a lintel like we had in St. Peter's, but it has arches. In this case, it's pointed arches. Notice the arches come to a point and go back down like that. Roman arches were semicircular. And before we had this kind of cathedral, we had a cathedral type, basilican type called Romanesque before we got into Gothic, which is what this is. And Romanesque also had round semicircular arches. But here you can tell that when it's Gothic is when it has the pointed arch. All right, then there's this row here, which represents the space above the aisle, where there's a roof above the aisle, and there's this little extra space here. It's called the triforium zone. And up here is glass. There's windows, just like St. Peter had. But in this case, the glass is really big, and it's filled with colored glass, so it's stained glass. And what happened was, after St. Peter's was built in the 300s, many other churches were built over time, like St. Peter's. And as time went on, they became bigger and more impressive and more, like Roman buildings. But they were big and heavy and fortress-like and dark on the inside. And those buildings had a flat roof. Notice that this has a vaulted roof. At least the ceiling of the nave is vaulted. But before they would just have a beam of wood across, creating a grid, and they would fill that in and have this big triangular attic on top of that. But that's a whole lot of wood, and wood unfortunately burns, and lots of churches burned down because of so much wood in them. So they decided let's make as much of the structure out of stone as possible. So when they decided to make vaulted ceilings like this, they made it so that there wouldn't be as many churches burning down, which is a good thing. So, but when the Gothic period came along, they added the point to the arch, and what the point does is it gives it a little bit more height, but it also distributes the load of the weight of this vaulting, goes down, and instead of going so much outward, it goes more vertically down to these piers. So it's an engineering thing, something to make it so you can have a loftier thing, and you can also take the structure that is here and put it on the outside. You can see here, these structural members here, these buttresses, are holding up the roof. And even though that they're out here, the way that they hold up the roof is what's called, this is a section through the middle. This is the nave, and this is the aisle. And out here is this great big heavy buttress. And the buttress has this arch pushing kind of against the wall of the nave. This one pushes, this arch right here is pushing right at the point where this arch would be coming down, and it makes a connection here. And all the force that's coming down this way that wants to push out, well, this is pushing it in the opposite direction, and the weight that is coming from the roof up here is transported down here, so that the lots and lots of structural things, lots of the support for what's going on here doesn't have to be in the wall, and that's important. This is the ground plan. You can see that this is the nave here. These are the piers that goes around here, and you see the apse. And this is the transept. The structure that's holding up the building is these things on the outside. So you see the structure, but you only see it on the outside. And what happens is when you're in the inside and you look, you just see an opening here. You don't see this. And the opening means that you can have much more glass area, surface area, which means there's more light coming in. This period, called the Gothic period, began at a specific date, in history. It's in the in the 1100s, when an abbot who was building a church or having a church built and decided that he wanted more light in the church. And the reason is because he had read some scholar in the past who had likened the light coming in, physical light, as being a metaphor for the presence of God. And since a church itself is the city of God, and it's supposed to be like a heavenly place when you walk in, that having light coming in is a desirable effect that you want to give the people who come into the church. So opening up the wall and making more space was desirable for the Gothic builders. And by doing this, what I'm talking about is putting the structure on the outside and putting as much weight of stone out here to have the effect of supporting the things on the inside. You can have a big lofty space with lots and lots of glass, lots of area for glass to allow much more light in. And then they fill that window space with colored glass, and the colored glass has pictures in it. If you've ever seen them, these things are filled with imagery and stories telling within the pictures to make a dazzling display. Not entirely unlike the kind of art that I described that the original barbarians in the north made. This kind of thing. Stained glass is very much like this, and the kind of abstractions you have to do to make pictures in glass are similar to this kind of thing. So those traditions were kept alive and expressed through architecture to create the kind of experience that you have when you go into a Gothic cathedral. Emphasis here on the verticality, on walls being as light as they can be. Here you see the stone and it's very heavy looking, but churches before this were even heavier. They had more, the piers were closer together, and the wall thickness was greater, and you felt like you were in a more of a fortress kind of place, and the walls, the windows would be smaller and it would be darker inside. So going from that Romanesque style to this style is one where walls are opened up, more skeletal looking, I guess you could say, instead of thicker, and emphasis on vertical height and open space and light coming in. So that's the Gothic look. Very complex things. If you ever have a chance to see a Gothic cathedral, you should do it. All right, let's look at the outside of the building. This is the front door. Just to the right of the front door, if you could see it in the above picture there, just here, you can see how that the front door is an arch, and the arch is sort of stepped back into the actual doorway. And what's called the jamb of the door, J-A-M-B. These figures are on little colonnettes on the outside as you walk in. And there's a complex of these. There's 3 doors. Each one has several of these colonnettes on either side. So there's lots and lots of these tall, skinny figures made of stone, carved to look kind of like they're part of the building, like they're columns themselves. So the earlier part of the Gothic here, what we're looking at, is where the sculpture on the cathedral is conceived of as part of the architecture, that it's architecture that has been carved and made into shapes. Notice that they like to carve everything. They like to make put detail and work into every single space, not entirely unlike what we saw in manuscript illumination, what they did with the letters. They want to put decoration in every little space as part of their devotion to make the whole thing more special. So what we see here is that these are figures on the outside to show you the contrast between this kind of figures and what we saw in the Greek period, Greek classic period, or the Greek Hellenistic period, where There was either the ideal Greek or the Greek look that had emotion or motion being expressed. Here, we're so many centuries away from that, and the figures are much more distorted. They're not part of some ideal that came from the ancient times. This is more the something closer in kin to the kind of things that would be in that jewelry that I showed you before, or manuscript illumination, where figures are distorted in some way. These are kind of like dolls, but they're dolls that have been stretched out to look kind of like columns. The clothing that you see they're kind of robes, and we call it drapery. That is the drapery on them is rendered in such a way so as to create all sorts of decorative patterns. If you look at them close, you see every one has a different kind of drapery, and you see they like to, put lots of pleats, lots of lines, lots of little zigzaggy things that look like arabesques or cascading folds and drapes like this series here, so as to have, to please the eye, something to put a lot of work into a space, to add extra value to it. So their interest in this in the image that they're making is one of decoration, and one that comes from the tradition of those early barbarians of putting a lot of work into a space, and to add value with pattern, and not being terribly concerned about naturalism. In contrast, here's another cathedral, the same place, the jam figures on a cathedral not very far away from Chartres Cathedral, called the Reims Cathedral. And it has a different kinds of sculpture on its outside. This is later in the Gothic period, where it happened that the sculptors had access to actual Greek and Roman sculpture to look at. And so they were able to actually capture the look of Greek and Roman. This actually looked like Roman kind of figures with the way the Romans represented togas. But you can see that this figure, at least, has that contrapposto stance. That goes back all the way to Greece, and the same sort of things. The little knee poking out is sort of an indicator that a person is standing in that contrapposto stance. So that even in a time when Greece is so far away, and so far away in time and geography, that they're still interested in bringing back that kind of thing sometimes, and of course, cathedrals have been made by lots of different craftsmen. And in this instance, one craftsman appears to have made these two, and another one made this one, and a third made this one. They're all different styles mixed together. This style is much more, stretched out with a tiny kind of head, and much more emphasis on decorative drapery, rather than this, which is, more real, more like the Romans would do. So all of these things existed at the same time in the Middle Ages, but the one that we're responsible for on your list is this one. And if you had a case